Okay, good night to all. Welcome back. I think tomorrow we are reopen the inscriptions to the classes, to the lectures. We had almost 15 students, but I don't know why they are coming so few. So maybe we could start today with the questions about yesterday, because the last part we didn't open for you to make comments.
Okay, so sorry, please.
Yep, go.
Can you comment about the awareness, the different awareness of the individual in the medieval times and in our times, how this transformation between affects the actions of those under surveillance.
Mm-hmm. So what are you saying? That how to compare them?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a big question, and what do we know about how people respond to surveillance? Historically, we know it from various kinds of records, and the further back we go, the less records are available. So it becomes more difficult to really be able to answer that question in a reliable way. But there are important figures who have tried to understand these kinds of things. There is I can't remember where he came from originally, but he ended up teaching in the UK for a number of years. Norbert Elias, and he did a lot of historical sociology of what he called the civilizing process. And that went back to early medieval times. And some of his insights on how people regarded public authorities and the limited recording of some details of people's lives that were made. He wrote about that. And it does give us some clues, but really it's very hard to tell what the early historical record, we don't have a full enough historical record to really know. It has to be pieced together from rather different sources. But even today, what do we really know about how people think about surveillance and how people imagine surveillance? So when we come to the lecture on Monday, when we talk about the culture of surveillance, then we start trying to understand that a bit more carefully. Back in the, let me see, turn of this century, around maybe late 1990s, early 2000s, I can't remember the exact dates, we did make an international survey of attitudes to surveillance and privacy. It was a very complicated survey, and we got some pretty good results, but it was complicated. So we were in China and India and Japan, several countries. But even that, which comes out as a large book of research reporting, even that only gives you people's feelings about surveillance within certain kind of categories. We move towards it, but I think it's really hard to get accurate ideas. You end up having to not just do interviews with people, but in-depth interviews and group analyses and so on in order to really get to the bottom of that. But it's a really good question, and really I think a lot of what goes on in the regulatory field, law relating to data about persons, has to rely on that rather minimal set of investigations. So yeah, it's a complex question. It's a really good question. But it's not one that's easily answered at all. Brazil was among the 9 countries that we studied in that large study a number of years ago. I think it came out eventually in 2009, that study. And its title is The Globalization of Personal Data. And, so that's one that is worth looking at. And only the other day I heard from somebody else who was finding it helpful for the work they are doing on their country. But yeah, good question. Other questions or comments from yesterday? Okay, well, while I was just talking about where we are in the lectures, and I want to just remind you of where we're going. So today, well, it's a bit optimistic, panopticon to the present. We're not really getting to the present. That's tomorrow. But we do get to the end of the 20th century tonight. So we're not stuck in old history for a long time. But I do think the historical is really important for understanding what now happens. So tonight, yeah, the panopticon to the end of the 20th century, maybe. And then tomorrow we'll talk about the expansion of surveillance during the last part of the 20th century and into the present century. And then on Thursday, the last day for this week, we look at data valence and surveillance capitalism. So that's when we're going to talk about the surveillance capitalism questions. And then next week, the Monday class is the one about surveillance culture and how we interact with surveillance in the present day. Then I want to look at globalizing surveillance, how surveillance has developed differently in different parts of the world. And I'll try to make some comments about China and India, the two largest population masses in the world, and each of which has a really fascinating surveillance story to tell. One has to do with so-called social credit in China, and the other has to do with Aadhaar, which is the national biometric registration system in India. I'll say something about that, but I don't quite know how much to do that evening. You can advise me if you like, because we can just go on talking about these things forever, but you can advise me. The other thing that I thought might be quite interesting would be to look at the current war in Israel, Gaza, and to talk about that in terms of surveillance. Oh, I see, you're nodding. Okay, so, well, maybe I'll summarize China and India, and then we can talk about the Gaza-Israeli Zionist war, because there are several really important kind of lessons to be learned from thinking about that situation. And, you know, it's fresh in everyone's minds. Every single day there's more news, but there's not always news about the surveillance and military intelligence and all that sort of thing, but it's actually critical to what is happening. So, okay, well, Tuesday then we'll talk about Gaza and some other things that relate to globalizing surveillance. Wednesday, I want to try to draw together some of the big challenges for today and to think about those, how what was called big data shifted into concerns about artificial intelligence and how we think about those. I really want to talk about smartness, because the slogan for selling these technologies is smart. whether it's smartphones, smart cities, smart everything. That is that's the way these things are sold. So my entry point, I think, is smartness. So we talk about smartness on that Wednesday, and then on the last evening, we look at alternatives for human-centered surveillance. And as we've said a lot about or will have said a lot about the technologies and the issues with the technologies, I want us to try to remember what human-centered rather than tech-centered surveillance might look like, and how tech could be turned to fit human beings rather than human beings being turned to fit tech. Sounds simple. It's not straightforward or simple, but it represents a different way of trying to think about these issues that I personally believe is tremendously important. So that's where we're going, just so that you have a clear idea. And now I know what to say on the whichever night it is. Tuesday night, we're going to talk about Israel Gaza and what's happening there in surveillance terms. Okay, so we started with the panopticon last night, or we discussed a little bit about the panopticon. And we'll come back to that as a starting point, a little bit of overlap or apparent overlap, and then we will move forwards and think about other important moments in the development of surveillance, and try to begin to see how the surveillance and surveillance technologies relate to each other. I think that's an important thing for us to be discussing too. Bentham, as I said last night, wanted to automate surveillance. And the automation was something that he was very enthusiastic about because, well, apart from anything else, Bentham actually hoped to make a lot of money out of the invention of the panopticon. It's not quite clear, but it's pretty clear that he would have liked to have been the inspector in the first panopticon to be built, but there wasn't one built in the country where he lived, which was the UK or England. But they did get built one way and another in other parts of the world, in other parts of Europe and other parts of the world. I was in Bogota one day, and I discovered that the National Museum in Bogota, Colombia, was originally a panopticon prison. And the only part of the old prison that is called El Panoptico is the snack bar. So the snack bar is named El Panoptico. So go figure. Anyway, you should just stop me telling stories because it makes me get off the point. What was I saying? Oh yeah, so 19th century. Change accelerates in the world of surveillance, and all sorts of interesting ways that surveillance develops in the 19th century. We don't have time to go into all of them. You've probably come across Bertillonage, which is the determination of the likelihood of a person becoming a criminal because of the shape of their head, or the size of their ears, or some physiological feature that Bertillon and several other early criminologists worked out was going to be the way of identifying who were likely to be criminals by their physiological makeup. Lots of measuring went on, lots of taxonomy of human beings' physical bodies. But there were also other technologies, and we'll say a little bit about those. And the backdrop was the emerging nation state, the notion that you could have a state for a nation, and that rather than working with empires and other forms of governmental organization, the nation state was becoming the important figure for developing societies in the 18th, 19th century. And so you have both those things going on at the same time. The nation state is forming and new technologies are emerging. And the new technologies often feed into the way that the state emerges, but the way the state emerges also calls for new technologies in order to support the form of governance. So most obviously, bureaucratic organization that Max Weber talks about in his famous studies of rationalization. These things work together. The technologies are not the driver of surveillance. So often, and we'll come more and more to this, so often there's a kind of belief that it is new technologies that prompt new forms of surveillance. New forms of surveillance come for all sorts of reasons, and they're developed sometimes by accident. And the idea of a technological push to increase surveillance is only partially correct. And of course, during the, if we jump forward into the 19th and into the 20th century, bureaucratization of the nation state, yes, and workplaces and corporations from the early 20th century, really important. And then during the early part of the 20th century, you had forms of communism and National Socialism that would also end up using technologies in order to support them. I mean, the Third Reich in Germany was supported by international business machines. That was at the time a very young company, and they provided the punch cards for determining the classification of Jewish people and non-Jewish people in Germany. So the surveillance is brought into play for all sorts of different reasons and in different ways. And companies that, you know, very respectable companies like IBM were actually involved in the 1930s and 40s. And then you also had colonial contexts well beyond Europe, where for different reasons, different forms of authoritarian dictatorships emerged, especially in Central and Latin America, about which you know a lot. Surveillance, as I was trying to make clear yesterday, however, is an ancient practice or an ancient set of practices. You know, it occurs in, I mentioned the Bible last night, the Hebrew scriptures, the Jewish scriptures. Note how watchers stand guard at the city gate and scan for danger outside the city. They're monitoring movement. They're warning about attack. They're seeing people that don't belong in that city and checking to discover what they are there for, why they are present. They're looking for unusual behavior. So, I mean, that's in the Hebrew scriptures. We're talking about many centuries before Christ. New Testament itself, if we stick with the Bible, tells of Jesus' parents. Why did they end up in Bethlehem? Well, because of a Roman census. More surveillance. And so it's a common theme in many places. And we could talk about ancient Egypt, ancient China. There are many places where there are important traces of surveillance activity. In Europe, it wasn't until around the 16th century that surveillance came to be something that started to affect people's lives in a more routine way. Why? Because of greater mobility. People started moving around more, rather than simply being in one village, one rural, agrarian context for all of their lives. And so greater movement, again, for various reasons, led to developments of certain kinds of checking up on people by government and by local government as well as national government. For example, that mobility that was occurring in the 17th century in Europe prompted concerns about, well, who was actually responsible for people who are poor? Because sometimes it was poorer people who were moving from one place to another in search of employment, in search of some means of livelihood. And so that produced government investigations, government interventions of a very early kind. And more generally, because people were moving around, the sociologist Georg Simmel observes that the figure of the stranger becomes more significant. Who is this person who is here? How are they like or unlike us? And on what grounds can we include them or exclude them in, exclude them from our community? Surveillance needed for that too. And so trust is challenged, a basic category of human life. We can't have a society unless we have trust. The more trust we have, the more likely it is that other aspects of society are going to be reasonably palatable, reasonably enjoyable for people. Trust, however abstract and however difficult to achieve that sounds, is still critical for how we get on in society at large. And so tokens of trust started to be used. The 20th century, we have lots of, by the 20th century, you have lots of tokens of trust. Who may drive an automobile, a vehicle that has no horsepower attached to it? Who may drive one of those? Well, eventually they thought of licensing people to say, yes, you are fit to drive one of these things that has an internal combustion engine. So, trust is challenged. You need tokens of trust. Yes, I have a license. I can show you my license to drive. And of course, as we go through the 20th century, so that expands to other things. The 20th century sees the invention of the passport, for example. There were crude letters of passage that you could take earlier in certain societies. But by the 20th century, we're starting to think about passports, signed government documents that declared your identity and your membership of some specific country. And those tokens of trust then could become the basis for citizen claims. I am a citizen. Look, here's my driver's license. Here's my passport. Here's the thing that shows that I am a legitimate member and am eligible for this benefit or that benefit. Every one of these requires more surveillance. We need to have a record of who has licenses, passports, and so on. City growth also spawned new kinds of policing. We can jump back to the, let me see this thing, it's going to work for us. We can jump back to the 17th century. Oh, there we go. So these two characters were important. There was police chief in Paris, France, in the 1600s. And he was given the task of turning Paris, which was one of the most unsafe cities in the world, into something that was a little bit more safe to live in. And so he appointed this person, Nicolas de Régny, and he was going to clean up the city. They were going to clean it up in all kinds of ways. And the key way that de la Régny decided he was going to do this was to light up the city. And so on the other slide, you can see a lamplighter going around with his little tinderbox, getting each of the lights lit up to make Paris, as it came to be called, the City of Lights. Now, you might think that they called it the City of Lights for tourists. Tourists hadn't been invented in a big way. It was because it was a police city, Paris, and they had lights to try to dissuade criminal activity in the streets. So there was a technical invention, lights, but the point of the lights was to make it less possible for criminal activities in the streets after dark. So that was Jean-Baptiste Colbert's street lighting scheme put into practice by de la Régny. And then, of course, we have our friend Jeremy Bentham with his panopticon, which is the next slide. I can make this thing work, but oh yes. The panopticon, the all-seeing place, the multi-story prison design whose circular plan involved central inspection. But prisoners, of course, couldn't see that they were being watched, even as they were very well seen. Part of the reason for the semicircular building was so that the prisoners could be backlit, lit from behind, so that they could be seen at least in silhouette. And they were visible to the central inspector, if indeed the central inspector was present, but they didn't know whether he was or not. And then Foucault, as we said last night, pinpointed the panopticon as the pivot on which modern surveillance turned. Really interesting insight, not one that I fully agree with, but one that is a fascinating way in to thinking about what surveillance is in that context. This all-seeing place, as Michel Foucault called it, well, panopticon, that's what it means. In that place, Foucault says, visibility became a trap. Visibility became a trap. It was intended to automate control, as I say, dispensing entirely with the physical violence that had characterized prison life up until then, relying instead on the prisoner's self-discipline, fabricated from the fear of consequences of non-compliance. And in that sense, the surveillance was formative. It had an effect on people, in that those subject to the hidden gaze would be reformed as reliable citizens as they came to respond to the ways in which they were being encouraged to fulfill the norms of the organization. That is why Foucault thought that the panopticon was a place where visibility became a trap. The visibility aspect of the panopticon was one aspect. Bentham's plan was also formative in other ways. It wasn't just a vision machine, because within that prison, within the different divisions of the panopticon, the prisoners were divided into categories depending on what sort of crime they had committed. So it was also a sorting machine, not just an automating of surveillance. It was a sorting machine. And that has so often been the story of surveillance, that it is making visible different groups of people and sorting them according to categories. I began to mention that last night, and as I understand it, that's a critically important part of surveillance. Now, Foucault talked in other places about the sorting of subjects into different categories, but he never really wrote in a big way about how the panopticon itself was a sorting machine. So, depending on the crimes committed or the likelihood of violence of one prisoner to another, they were put in categories within the prison. And Bentham, of course, also thought of his prison plan as something that you could lift up and put into a factory. That's where his brother got the idea from, a factory. Or you could pick it up and have the same design for a school, for a place of learning. A similar kind of practice could be used in a school or a hospital or a factory or wherever. That was his hope. Interestingly, back to Foucault, when he was talking about the panopticon, and within the chapter on panopticon in his book, Punir et surveiller, which I don't know how it comes out in Portuguese, but in English it comes out as discipline and punish, whereas the French title is Punir et surveiller, so punish and surveil. Interesting. Don't ask me why they changed the words in the English version, but there it is. Of course.
Yes.
Translation is like,
Portuguese
yeah.
is which?
Okay.
Okay.
Like,
There you are. More faithful. More faithful. So, what else did he say in that chapter? Well, he talked about plagues. He didn't just talk about Bentham's panopticon. He talked about how people dealt with plagues. And that was part of his panoptic story. Panopticon without the panopticon. And he saw the ways of limiting the effects of plagues as being part of an embryonic surveillance in the modern era. And I suspect that people who have lived through Ebola and SARS and then the COVID-19 pandemic might not be aware of the longer history of mitigating plagues, unless you had great-grandparents who were involved in the so-called Spanish flu, which was not Spanish at all, in the early part of the 20th century. Unless you had some memory of that, a very large-scale pandemic hadn't taken place between the Spanish flu and COVID-19. SARS, Ebola, and so on were pandemics, but they weren't nearly as big as the COVID-19 one. Anyway, surveillance was also a byproduct then of introducing more scientific approaches to life, and this affected other areas. So the military, for example, became a place of very close and intensive surveillance. And indeed, as the attempt was made to make military activity more scientific, so there was more surveillance that went with it. And military personnel started to go through routines in training that had never been part of military training before, calculating each soldier's move for its efficiency. We could go on. The military is another area where surveillance, where the military was modernized, also was increasingly under surveillance. Government administration, as I already said, was bureaucratically organized using ordered files and official hierarchy, facilitating surveillance of both people and things. So while organizations within and beyond the state prompted new forms of surveillance, there were also specific technologies that were developed for various purposes before being adopted or adapted for surveillance. So if we're coming towards the end of the 19th century, another thing that's happening is that certain technologies were being invented. It was a time of the proliferation of inventions. If we looked at photography from the 1860s, 1870s, the phonograph from the 1880s, which became the gramophone, which became the record player, which became the cassette player, which became the whatever came next, CD player, which became etc. all the way to Spotify. Anyway, there was another technology, and the telephone, of course, again from the late part of the 19th century. None of them were invented for surveillance purposes. They weren't surveillance technologies, but their surveillance potential was recognized. And so they started being surveillance tools. But that's not what their inventors had in mind. There's a wonderful American historian of surveillance called Josh Lauer, and his articles and books on the history of surveillance pre-20th century is totally fascinating. Early cameras, for example, were called in some places detective cameras. Why? Because you could find out things that you couldn't necessarily find without the aid of a portable camera. That was the important thing, of course, that it was portable and could be transported from one place to another. It wasn't a huge, heavy device that had to be, moved on the back of a cart. A portable camera could produce candid images of people in all kinds of activities that they may not have wanted of which they might not have wanted images to be made at all. So the information environment, as it were, was changing already in the 19th century. Again, we tend to think about, modern surveillance. That means computers. Computers weren't there until the Second World War. And so there were many surveillance tools that you might not think of as surveillance tools that were very important as surveillance tools, even though that's not what they were invented for. And they fill quite an important gap in the history of surveillance as we begin to think about them. So the photography made possible, the recording of images, phonography, the phonograph, the recorded voice. So then you could have an audible record as well as, or instead of, a visible record. And the telephone also enabled remote listening. What it didn't do, of course, was to record the telephone itself would not record the message for many decades, but it could be used for eavesdropping, listening to others who were communicating using the telephone. The camera too could be used for all kinds of purposes. In the United States, during the Prohibition era, in other words, the time when you couldn't buy alcohol in a store, in the Prohibition era, cameras started to be used for taking photographs of those who were actually drinking alcohol when it was not permitted, when it was illegal. And lots of embarrassment was caused by such activities, and maybe some people were apprehended for their misdemeanors. I don't know. And if you were Alphonse Bertillon and you were busy with working out what ears and eyes and noses and shapes of people's heads had to do with whether you're likely to be a criminal or not, camera was a godsend, because suddenly you could actually take pictures of these different types and have a massive inventory, like a catalog of human physiological features, so that you could determine who was more likely to commit a crime than someone else. And that, of course, is exactly what he did. That is what Alphonse Bertillon did, create these massive catalogs of human faces and physiologies. So surveillance in all kinds of ways grows with or without technology. The technology sometimes is from a completely different area or purpose. The phonograph, for example. What did Edison think that the phonograph was going to be for? He never dreamed of playing music on his machine. And in the 21st century, it's unimaginable that you would have a device that could record and replay that didn't have the capacity to play music. He never dreamed of it. He thought it was for things like keeping family records. So you could have, for example, the record of somebody's last words before they died, and they could keep those in the family. He had all kinds of wonderful ideas for what to do with his phonograph. It wasn't playing music, but it had good surveillance effects that you could use phonograph for. So in other words, all sorts of things could happen with technologies that were never intended for surveillance per se, but they became used as surveillance tools, and it's an important part of the story. Telephone, of course, just one footnote on that. You've probably seen or heard even stories, film or stories about the switchboard operators of telephone systems. So before you had automated dialing that took you straight to the person that you needed to communicate with, you had to go through a central switchboard. You call the switchboard first. Well, you wouldn't do it like that. You would take the thing off there. Anyway, and you would ask the switchboard operator to put you in touch with someone else, and they would pull the plug on the machine in front of them and put it into the right plug so that you were then connected. Well, of course, the switchboard operator was in a great position for listening to all kinds of calls, and that's exactly what happened with switchboard operators. They became notorious for listening into other people's conversations, and also, if they felt it necessary or advisable, passing on that information to others who might be interested in what this person said to that person. So surveillance of a very informal kind that could become quite formal if the sharing was with a police officer. So modern surveillance isn't just about some story of scientific and technological advance and rationalization and control, as some people tend to say. It's also about the common use of new media for all sorts of purposes. It's not the technologies themselves. It's the growing amount of mediated evidence that you can find that institutions and individuals practice, that they preserve for future use and check up on later. And that was encouraged by 19th century bureaucratic record keeping, and long before 20th century machines that eventually were to become computing machines. So let me jump into another area where, are you with me so far? Just let me know if you're not with me or if you have a burning question. I think one of the interesting developments that's worth talking about in surveillance is mid and later 20th century development of welfare states. Welfare states. Generally, welfare states were developed after the depressions between the two wars of the 20th century. Many countries went into depression, and there were knock-on effects from one country to another as the feeble financial situation and commerce and production and so on was negatively affected. And in such contexts, in Europe and the USA and in a number of countries around the world, national systems were created intended to ensure that neither unemployment or old age or illness would mean a slide into poverty and deprivation. But how could you have a welfare state unless you knew who the people were who needed most help? There had to be records, and there had to be records that crossed various barriers. So medical barriers, nursing, records of income, all these things became important within welfare state systems, which of course, because they were all referring to identifiable citizens of that country, became important modes of surveillance. And these had names. It was called in Britain, it was called national insurance. In the United States, it was called Social Security. Different names in different places, but numbering was basic to welfare surveillance and still is. And in this case, the purpose of the surveillance was entirely geared to socially positive aims and was gratefully received by millions of people in numerous countries where welfare systems were developed. And so here was a surveillance not of control or coercion, but a surveillance of care. Because this country cares about the state of its citizenry, so we will develop a system to try to ensure that nobody falls below a certain level such that they become indigent or just in an impossible state of health or whatever. So welfare states are an interesting case of surveillance for care. Now, of course, once they had developed, then all sorts of glitches and issues within them were discovered, and welfare states ended up, as we know today, not providing that that very clear way of distinguishing that didn't negatively view certain members of the community. All sorts of things came into welfare state surveillance, but their original purpose was for a kind of surveillance of care. Welfare states made people feel recognized. It mitigated the fears that some citizens had about being known by a number. A lot of people objected to other systems that reduced people to a number, as prisons, for example, always reduced folks to a number. And when it came to welfare states, in a number of countries, people seemed much more content to be known by a number. And that in itself, raises other questions. But of course, if we rely on numbers, then it makes the kind of surveillance that is done much more amenable to computerization when computers actually appeared. And that is exactly what happened. The numbered systems were gradually computerized, and we have today the outcome of that computerization. One of the key things that I mentioned at the end of my talk last night, maybe it was at the end of the talk and you didn't remember, but I said surveillance is always ambivalent. I don't believe that we should think of surveillance simply as something that is negative, coercive, cramping to the human being. It is something that can express, however weakly, a desire for human flourishing. And at the end of the day, in my books, if surveillance is worth anything, then it's worth something in a human flourishing context. But that means that the surveillance itself has to be done in a way that supports human flourishing. Okay, how are we doing? Oh, romping along. Time for questions. Yep, go.
You talk about the early criminologists.
Yeah.
Why don't those how English, and how they looked for criminals based on their physiological features. So I started to think that now a lot of countries have database with the genetic material
Yep.
of their citizens, and I would like to know, is that considered a new kind of surveillance? And if it is, I would like to understand how it is related to bioethics and human rights, because now the state's not only watching and their citizens and not watching their criminals, but they know everything about them, know their DNA. So I would like to understand.
Yeah, it's a great question. And of course, you're right to point out that there is a line between those efforts in the 19th century to try to classify people according to their physiological features and what you're talking about now, which is biometric and all kinds of other data, genetic data, and ways of classifying people that are now available to us. It raises all sorts of really good questions. If we had a whole term of classes together, then we could go into some of those details, and we could watch some films that help us think about those issues. Did you ever watch the movie Gattaca? Gattaca is all about this. It's all about a world where everyone is classified according to their DNA and according to various criteria that are available today. And yeah, it's a very interesting movie because it raises all these kinds of questions about the, as you say, bioethics, about what is permissible. You know, it might be possible to do this, but is it permissible to do it? That's always the question, the basic question we have to ask. But yeah, it's you're right to make the connection. And as I say, we've moved into territory that frequently, in my view, we frequently move much too fast into new territory and start establishing possibilities for classifying people in terms of their genetic makeup or whatever. And there are plenty of examples of how major mistakes have been made, such that while those data may well have been, there might have been ways of finding appropriate modes of using those data for human flourishing purposes. The way that they actually get made up is frequently problematic. And the reason for that is what we're going to be coming to whenever I said it was going to be. I think it's this Thursday we start talking about surveillance capitalism, and that has become a key issue because the connections between corporations and governments in the world of surveillance has become closer and closer and closer. And that becomes very problematic because it leads to questions about how these systems are regulated at all, and how they should be regulated. So yeah, it's a what you're asking is a really good question, and but if you haven't seen Gattaca, it's a good movie to watch because it quite poignantly raises these questions. I mean, it's quite an old movie now. There's probably a newer one out there that I haven't seen, but Gattaca is a bit of a classic in its way for looking at what happens in a world where we are distinguished by our our DNA and other similar records. And yeah, I'll let you watch the film, and you'll see what I mean. But yeah, great question. Other questions, comments, objections? Did I get something wrong that you would like to correct me on? Yeah. Oh, two people going to correct me. That's excellent. Go for it.
Our states specifically, because we talk a lot about private companies, and to me, private companies can have mutations directly from states, legislation. But who can lead state power when we talk about surveillance? Of course, we can talk about Congress and the role of politicians, but what reliability we have with that? If not, then who would work with that? Is there a path or a new way of thinking of security, both of data and information of people?
It's a great question. As I say, we are going to come to that set of issues. It's very it's a very problematic area, but it's becoming increasingly critical that we do grapple with that sort of question. So if it's okay, we'll leave it until we start trying to organize our thinking a little bit around that, because the novelty of surveillance capitalism means that we are actually facing situations that we have not faced before. It isn't something that we can simply look back to the past and say, well, here's a way of doing this that would suit the present. We have to find new ways of doing it in the 21st century because the situation has already gone beyond. And it refers to a whole number of areas, like smart cities, for example. Those who argue for smart cities are frequently also arguing that corporations should run the city and not governments. So there's a lot of debate about, you know, the nature of human social organization, who should be in control of what we are doing with our surveillance systems. But we'll come to that. There was one other question somewhere. Yeah.
Thinking about the concepts of surveillance through history, it seems like the act of breaking a rule or breaking a value is a reason to surveillance to emerge. And I would like to know if it's possible to make this statement in light of surveillance today, in light of the liquidity of surveillance now, because I feel like surveillance is more related to form or own desires than to safety issue.
Yeah, great question. And again, it's one that we're going to be dealing with. In terms of the kind of theoretical background to that, the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze wrote about that. He wasn't always very easy to understand, but he wrote about it. And his argument was precisely what you were saying, that today it has less to do with simply trying to constrain human activity using surveillance. So stopping people from doing certain things which are deemed to be inappropriate, wrong, unethical, illegal, or whatever. But more surveillance has to do with desire. It has to do with what we might want and how we participate in the process of surveillance. And Gilles Deleuze wrote about that. I already mentioned when I was talking about my my favorite legal scholars. One of them was Bernard Harcourt, and I still can't remember the title of the book he wrote, but it's got the word desire in there. Desire and discipline are both in the title, 2 D's, but I can't recall. I'll try to check it out. But it's a really good argument about exactly what you are asking. And there are others who are working in this area very, very helpfully to think about that transition. But you're absolutely right. Surveillance in the present is not only about attempting to mold people in a particular way, to behave in a particular way. That has become associated much more with desire, and we see it how it came about was through consumer surveillance and persuading the consumer that the surveillance being done on them is good for them because it will enable us to fulfill our desires, to follow through with whatever the item is or the service is or whatever that we are being offered. So desire comes to be a very important part of the whole story. But we will come to that. So keep your question in mind because it's a good question and we'll get to it. Okay? So that's a promise. And also for you. It's coming. It's coming. Patience. Should we continue or should we take a break?
Yes.
Okay. So comfort break or whatever we call it, just for a few minutes.
It's 5 or 10 minutes, 10 minutes.
Well, which is it, 5 or 10? Because I'm going to start in 5 minutes or 10 minutes. So let's just make it 5 because
Okay.
it depends how much you need to deal with your comfort, but we'll make it 5.
Okay, 5 minutes.
So 7:20-ish. Okay, so we should get back to the point. Got distracted talking with my colleague. So let's think about some features of contemporary surveillance. I don't know what happened to the slides, but so I had pictures of some of those 19th century devices that ended up being used for surveillance purposes. So all these 3 photos were taken in the 1880s. So that's what the portable camera looked like in the 1880s. That's what the phonograph looked like in the 1880s. And that's what the telephone looked like in the 1880s. So yeah, sorry, I left those off. Yes, store is monitored by video cameras. There are some stores in the States these days that have cameras that are not exactly obvious, and they check on so many things of consumers. But anyway, I'm going to, font is a bit small, isn't it? Can you read that? Features of surveillance today. I just want to go through some of these and give you some clues again so that we can build on them in another day. So the first thing then is that surveillance is continuous. Surveillance today tends not to be episodic, happening just as and when. Increasingly, it tends to be continuous within many agencies and organizations. It's not simply a single event that is triggered by some suspicion about a possible offender or an eager click on the page of the internet. And that's because organizations today are harvesting huge amounts of data in hope that patterns of consumption or movement or relationship will reveal something about you that is financially worth tracking and monitoring because it's a source of economic value. As I say, American shopping malls often have smart digital cameras that follow your movements through the store, by which door you entered, which vendors you visited in the shopping center, how long you spent at each one, what sorts of things you looked at within each section of the shopping mall. They're going to be checking on your spending habits and trying to shape your future shopping experience. Yeah, we'll come on to that a little later. But most surveillance today operates beyond bricks and mortar settings like physical supermarkets and mega stores and so on. Cars, for example, have become a key site for electronic gadgets, all of which collect data about the operation of the vehicle, both how it is working and how it is being used. So it's driver data that is also being picked up as the car goes wherever it goes. The driver will be one of those, but other users of the same vehicle will also have records in the car. And those data, of course, are very valuable to the automobile industry, and they may well contribute to road safety because you know more about the way people are driving cars in particular situations. So it could be a surveillance of control, it could be a surveillance of care. These things are ambivalent. Another feature, not just continuous, but also increasingly automated. In most cases, no human being decides that you are a target. Now, of course, in some cases of policing and so on, there is going to be a decision about you being a target. But the systems are generally created to make you visible to the organization or the platform whenever, for example, you send a message, cross a threshold, complete an action, or appear somewhere. Such visibility is specific to the purpose of the surveillance in question. Decades ago, when computers were first being used in workplaces to try to manage factory production or office work, automated ways of organizing staff became popular. Well, among managers anyway, they were popular. But it wasn't just a matter of computers taking on new tasks previously done by people. It was also that computers were keeping a record which had the effect of making all aspects of the workplace more visible to management. Workplace processes were, as Shoshana Zuboff showed in a much earlier book than The Age of Information Capitalism, in the book that she wrote in 1988, which was called The Rise of the Smart Machine. Same author as The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And so she suggested that work processes became themselves what she called informated. The process became amenable to informationalization, not just automated. Why? Well, new kinds of information about the style of working of each employee, the length of his or her breaks, and so on. All these became available to managers along with automation. It wasn't just that the tasks were gaining automated aspects to them, but also that they were gaining information about how workers were doing their work, which in turn helped them to increase their surveillance in the workplace and, of course, redistribute authority upwards. At the same time, something similar was happening in policing. Sociologist Gary T. Marks, who has always argued, as I'm arguing, for the ambivalence of surveillance. Nonetheless, in a book in 1988, which is called anyway, the subtitle is Police Surveillance in America. I can't remember what the title is, but the subtitle is Police Surveillance in America. Undercover, that's what the book's called, Undercover. He warned in the 1980s that there was a growing dependence of police on computers, and that this raised the prospect of what he called, as I say, this is 1988, a maximum security society. He is not some kind of extremist or fearing some scary future. He's a very, very steady sociologist, and anyone who knows anything about sociology may know the name Irving Goffman, very famous American sociologist. Well, Gary Marks studied with Irving Goffman, and he has a wonderfully Goffman-esque understanding of surveillance. But he was worrying in the 1980s about computerized records increasing everyone's transparency, especially using databases within police forces. And he said, you know, you might think that you live in the USA and this is a safe and democratic place to live, but he said even in the industrial democracies of the USA, a maximum surveillance society is emerging. So a third feature, surveillance is embedded in everyday activities, in routines of everyday life. It isn't a sort of special thing when you are doing some particular activity. Oh, it's then that I'm under surveillance. It's something that is embedded in all our everyday routines. So it's a long way from some 19th century secret agent going through the city with the coat lapel up and the hat on the head and the dark glasses. And it's so different, the kind of shift from a secret agent to not trailing a suspect down the streets, but checking on them. The streets themselves have their own sensors, their own cameras, just as buildings themselves now keep track of their occupants. Cars monitor their drivers all the time. Some cars, of course, are built to prevent drivers from driving if they have had too much to drink. The car won't even start. And so this is the kind of world that we have made. Phones, of course, well, we've talked about them. They keep a continuous record of where, when, how, and by whom they are used. Scanners, detectors, recording devices are all part of everyday life. They offer convenience, they offer safety, they offer reassurance, but they're always surveilling for many purposes. So it's embedded. Surveillance is embedded in the routines of everyday life. You couldn't have said that in the 19th century or the early part even of the 20th century. And you certainly couldn't have said it in the 17th century. But today it's embedded in the routines of life. Surveillance has become infrastructural to contemporary societies. It is part of the world in which we live, and it is fundamentally inescapable. And a fourth feature, it is in context. It's contextualized. The technologies now enabling surveillance are the product of very rapid innovation in the early parts of the early decades of the 21st century, which have significantly altered the character of surveillance. Agreement on what counts as appropriate regulation has been simply unable to keep up this far. So what do these tensions mean today? And how do we know what surveillance is like in the 21st century, and in particular, where the fault lines between appropriate surveillance and inappropriate surveillance lie in all these different areas. What sorts of efforts are being made to evaluate and place bounds around surveillance to ensure that it promotes rather than precludes a quest for a fairer and more sustainably human world. As I say, there's always a tension between the possible and the permissible. Actually, I get those words from a computer scientist that I knew at the University of Toronto back in the 1990s. He's no longer with us, but he wrote a book that was all about not just possible computing, so much in computing science is about what is possible today. He said, well, it's fine being possible, but is it permissible? And I think that that is one of the questions that we should be asking. It might be possible, but is the possible permissible? And how do we decide, and how do we ensure that that which is permissible rather than just that which is possible becomes what we have to live with? So these pressures all reflect a very ambivalent world, as I say, of surveillance. Frequently, as I've also said this evening, surveillance is established for a reason with which many would agree is a good thing. We want to keep society safe. We want to have a productive society. We want to have a society that is relatively governable, where we have agreed on what are appropriate ways of governing ourselves within a democratic context. I think many would agree too that we want to ensure that those who need assistance from the state will actually get it, will actually receive it. Presumably, we also have a stake in whether or not companies actually improve their products. We would like them to improve their products because frequently they don't do what they claim they do, and we want them to make better ones. So I think we'd be quite agreed that we want stuff that we buy to be worth buying. We would also agree, I think, that we would want to track the course of disease, especially if it was a serious disease that was causing severe pain or severe symptoms of some other kind, or that was killing people. I think we would want to know that the course of disease is being tracked so that it could be, if possible, checked, or at least that we could get medical help to those who were most in need. These are all reasons for having more surveillance, aren't they? Do you agree that those are the sorts of things that we might think are appropriate or helpful or constructive for human living together? You might not agree with all of them, but several of them I bet you agree with that we do want. So the type of agency organizing the surveillance, the way that data are handled, and the lack or the avoidance of appropriate regulation may compromise those positive aspirations of those doing the surveillance. Such tensions between what is possible, what is permissible, what is desirable, and whether we want a particular kind of surveillance to answer to that desirable need are the questions that we have to ask in the 21st century. They are not optional questions anymore, any more than questions about climate change are optional. They are not optional. This is happening. Surveillance is also happening. And we have a parallel set of concerns where there are ambivalent matters that we have to address. And all these features make things and the people associated with them, whether the police, employers, government departments, internet companies, whatever, surveillance is unprecedentedly pervasive today. It gets everywhere. But a parallel shift makes the activities of those doing the surveillance less and less visible to those whose lives are rendered more transparent. I hope you understand that. Our lives are increasingly visible to many organizations and agencies, and at the same time, our knowledge of, and especially our understanding of, that surveillance is decreasingly visible. There is so much happening that it's very hard to know what's going on. So the visibility is becoming exponentially disproportionate. So what can we say? Visibility is what I'm saying, is very unevenly distributed. They know about us far, far, far more than we know about them, to put it very simply and boldly. And there are many reasons for this, not least the reasons that I've just been given you. It's embedded in the structures of everyday life. We can't actually escape it. Datafied systems have been miniaturized and tucked away where we can't see them, like the machinery of an old-fashioned watch. You can actually see mine because mine has no battery and has no connection with anything electronic. It's run by motion. I move my arm, my watch is keeping itself going. It's not keeping it going, I'm keeping it going. But it has no connections to anything else. But how many things in life are like that? Not very many. As soon as we're, out of here, you're very politely not on your phones just now, but you'll be on your phone very soon after the class is finished. You'll be immediately connected. You may be driving a car, and that car is finding out about you all the time. You see what I'm saying? It's infrastructural. We can't evade it. So how do we live with it? How do we talk about the difference between the possible and the permissible? And why do we want to? And all these questions are really important for us. Surveillance itself has also become more invisible because of the technically obscure systems by which they operate. Few today claim to know how a computer system works, any more than they might say they know how their car works. And in any case, if you look inside your car these days, it looks very like a computer. And there's only a few things recognizable from the car that you might have driven 30 years ago. Beyond this, surveillance is achieved by using arcane algorithms. The algorithms that make up the surveillance systems for analyzing, well, frequently for actually obtaining the information in the first place, and then for analyzing it, they're frequently arcane. They are not understandable to ordinary people. And if you talk to the computer scientists and the data scientists that are creating those algorithms, if you talk to them for long enough, they will admit that they don't know either exactly how the algorithm that they just built works. And the more we engage AI, the less we'll know, especially if it's based on machine learning and so on. The less we'll know about how the thing actually works in the first place and why it works the way it works. So we're at a very interesting point in the whole business of surveillance. The algorithms, the codes are very, very important. And not today, but another day, I'll tell you about Joy Buolamwini. Joy Buolamwini is a computer scientist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And her PhD dissertation was all about algorithms. And after writing her PhD and discovering how, in particular, the algorithms for facial recognition fail if you happen to be female and black, she started on a completely different trajectory from what she was doing in computer science before, to develop a sense of what algorithmic justice would look like. Of course, there are lots of reasons why algorithms may be highly problematic, not least because they're frequently made by men, and white men at that. And so what she found out as a black woman at MIT was a very interesting finding. The algorithms are highly problematic. They do not give the direct answers to those who have made them as to exactly how they work, or they are used in a way that is contradictory, or they are systematically created in a way that will actually give unequal kinds of emphasis to different groups of people in the population. So Joy Walamwini is somebody who has understood the difference between possible and permissible technology. She's still a computer scientist. She's doing really interesting work, but she is now committed to something called algorithmic justice. And she founded the Algorithmic Justice League in order to encourage such activity that is aware of the difficulties of the building algorithms and so on. So in spite of the fact of surveillance becoming less visible, people are more and more visible. And this social visibility is increasing at an exponential rate in our world today. In Renaissance Europe, few ordinary citizens would have had any idea about what their queen or king looked like, let alone what their lives were like. Today, the lives of presidents, prime ministers, and other leaders, and even their families, are often an open book to ordinary citizens. But at the same time, we ourselves are seen in much more precise and intimate ways by organizations. They may not know us any more than we could say with confidence that we know power holders or celebrities whose lives have become more open to us in a way. But what is known about us by today's large organizations is both considerable and consequential. So very few people have a sense of how or why, how much they're surveilled, not only because of the hidden algorithms, but simply because most of these things are not advertised or announced. Security agencies are secretive. Corporations like to guard their procedures and their intellectual property. Each entity has its reasons for not telling what they're doing. Furthermore, terms of service agreements, that's the thing that you click on without reading when you are getting a new app, right? Terms of service agreements, often in small print, lengthy, and in impenetrable jargon, that is to say, impossible to understand, reveal very little about surveillance. Surveillance makes people visible in particular ways. You're seen by surveillance not as the person that you think you are, or that your friends or your family think you are, but as someone who watches certain television series, parks a car each day on the same street, enjoys a baseball or football game, was educated at a particular kind of school, pays tax in a specific bracket, travels to beaches for vacations, whatever. You're known very partially by myriad organizations. Many consumers have a good idea of what data are collected and also view this kind of surveillance as a benefit. Of course, Amazon knows what I want. the person who owns an electric shaver with Bluetooth that tracks a user's motion may be grateful for guidance on the proper use of this technique. And as shaving is anything but a small snippet of one's day, it may seem trivial to their whole life. See, there are good reasons for not shaving, because you're being checked by Bluetooth surveillance systems. However, in the case of something like menstrual apps that many women use, there are significant consequences for-profit corporations, enterprises, beyond possibly inaccurate period tracking. In the USA, no law protects women from the misuse of their data, including their menstrual data. For example, in workplace pregnancy discrimination. So I can make jokes about saving, but I'm not going to make jokes about menstrual apps. Well, you can hear what I'm saying. I don't know how to say it again. So the surveilled are only partly visible to each organization or agency. But it's also true that these fragments of personal data become connected as data are shared for various reasons, economic reasons, governance reasons, creating a more complex picture. It still doesn't mean that you would recognize the image as yours. Only your data double is visible to organizations, however complex it becomes. I'll make just a few comments on the last bit, because I think it wraps things up. So I know we're getting very close to time and I'm watching it. Multi-directional. I've already said something about this, so I'll go quickly through it. Surveillance occurs in many ways, especially the ways that we as citizens, consumers, and so on become more visible, and as our surveillors become less visible. The stories I've pointed out is quite complicated. But how does surveillance operate today in ways that make our everyday lives to be pulled into the surveillance picture, for better or for worse? What's the direction of surveillance? Well, it all depends. There may be search and rescue missions that are highly dependent on surveillance. There could also be totalitarian dictatorships that are dependent on surveillance. These illustrate how surveillance has a multi-directional way of making others visible, and even making ourselves visible to ourselves or to others. So self-tracking apps, whether we use Fitbits or whatever, those are ways in which we use surveillance to make ourselves visible to ourselves. So we watch ourselves when we use our Fitbits and similar devices. Surveillance can be thought of as us against them, where they, as it were, look down from on high. We've talked about that. While this understanding of surveillance is frequently accurate, variations exist. Surveillance by police or taxation departments definitely are top-down. But the gaze may also be reversed. Crowds at a protest march may photograph police activities on their phones, for instance, as the police try to move demonstrators along or arrest them. This is sometimes called surveillance, not surveillance, surveillance. So valence from below, watching from below. And in this case, surveillance or surveillance is watching back. It's watching the watchers in a protest march or whatever. Surveillance can also be horizontal. And again, we engage in horizontal surveillance between peers. It's participatory. This is social surveillance. people watching each other and people watching each other's cats, of course, online. But the twist is this, that the platforms not only permit such neutral watching, they make millions of dollars or raise or whatever currency you have from employers, government departments, internet companies, multiplying and monetizing such everyday connections. That's what we look at under the surveillance capitalism section that we're coming to. Those companies are determined to generate enough content to occupy people who are spending increasingly more time online. Social surveillance also furnishes data for vertical, top-down surveillance. So what we do in social, horizontal surveillance is also used, that information is used in vertical surveillance. And we've talked about vertical. We're talking national security agencies, police, airport control, all these kinds of things. Some of them get together internationally and create surveillance systems, security systems that exist between several countries working together. So there's a whole spectrum of surveillance. You might think that checking on threatened or endangered species is a really good way of using surveillance, or as I say, search and rescue missions. So many of these are, can be used one way or another. Haven't said anything about drones. Drones have become tremendously important. I think I'll keep drones talk for when we're discussing Israel-Palestine, or Israel-Gaza, because the drones were tremendously important on both sides, as it were. Yeah, okay. So what I want to go on to talk with you about is how surveillance is so significant in today's world, especially in our digital times. We look at technologies that enable surveillance, but they don't make surveillance happen. We want to think about how and with what consequences data has become central to contemporary surveillance. That's one of the things that I want us to look at. And with data, I'm thinking of the algorithms that organize those data. And they're involved when we do our own surveillance. They're to do with police surveillance and crime. They're to do with all sorts of surveillance. And then we have to ask, in a world that is so suffused with this infrastructural surveillance, how do we decide which of these is really appropriate, which is fair, contributing to human flourishing, and which is not? Surveillance is ambivalent. It always has ethics. It always has politics. What are the politics of surveillance? Should we resist? Should we just relax and let it happen? Should we regulate? There's the three possible R's: resist, regulate, or just relax. How do we discern the likely, the depressing, or the desirable aspects of today's surveillance trends? I've left you with many more with many more questions than answers, but I hope you see what we're trying to do, or I'm trying to do, is to build up a picture so that we then have the means of discussing together about where we could go with surveillance, how we would discern between one kind of surveillance and another. And I think what I'll do is make sure that there is a little bit of time for discussion tomorrow. There are some short videos, and I think maybe one that is about a university student who has some medical issues, and she discovers what happens when different databases start talking with each other about her situation. I think I'll show you that one, because that is a good one for raising some questions. So I think that's what I'll do, because that concretizes it. We don't have time to watch a whole movie like Gattaca, so you can find lists of surveillance movies online, and some of them are really good. I mean, who knew when they started talking about predictive policing a few years ago, and bringing in predictive policing, that people would start saying, well, just a minute, isn't that what Minority Report was all about? And of course, Minority Report did appear to be prophesying what was going to happen in the policing realm. Minority Report, I think, is a fascinating movie, because it is so close to what actually happened in what we call predictive policing today. So there are ones that you could watch yourself on your own time, but maybe we'll watch one or two shorts, and I say they are short, like 12 or 15 minutes, and discuss around that. So you have questions, I'm sure. Let's start again tomorrow evening with some questions from today. So bring them along, and we'll talk about them. And you know, some of them are still, because we're so close to the beginning rather than close to the end, some of them are still ones that I might say, well, let's defer that until it's part of the sequence in which I'm trying to introduce these ideas to you. So if that's okay, sometimes I'll say, well, keep them till later, or in some cases, I'll try to answer them right away. Okay, good. And once again, you're more than welcome to email me. Actually, you can get both addresses now. So liond@queensu.ca will get me, queensu.ca will get me on my university account, and liondavid48 on Gmail will also get to me. So if you want to tell me your question in advance, then I can address it right away. If that's an easier way of doing it while I'm still remembering the question, then you can do that, and I'll list them and deal with them first tomorrow evening. Okay, all good? Good. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you
Okay.
so much, Professor. Thank you all. So good night for all. We see each other tomorrow.
Great.